In this session, we're going to look at what an effective roadmap should include. So let's have a quick reminder of the roadmap structure from session 1. As we can see, we've got the overarching time frame, and we've divided that time frame into iterations. There's 4 on this slide. Each iteration has its own outcome, and to keep the iteration on track, we have 3 repeatable processes: getting started, making progress, and realizing benefits. Iteration 1 on the left there is different to the other iterations because it's the iteration where the outcome is to organize the change. All the subsequent iterations, the outcomes are to actually implement whatever it is that we're making different, whatever change we're implementing. If we're asking those impacted by our change to use a roadmap, we might want to launch it with resources that make it as easy as possible for them to use. So here are some elements of the roadmap that might be worth investing in, putting some effort behind, so that after all, this is a collaborative process, we can ensure that everybody who's impacted by our change can easily help us to create it. The processes we've just talked about, those repeatable processes of getting started, making progress, and realizing benefits, understanding that there's a well-formed set of activities that can be repeated for each of the iterations, helps everybody understand what's required. That can be partnered with techniques about how we carry out any of the tasks. Some of these techniques relate to how to manage the change. For example, the benefits dependency network technique that I explain in the business need lesson, and the other techniques, perhaps, which are related to your specific change. If you're restructuring a team or you're launching a new product, there might well be techniques, how you do things, that are unique to that particular piece of work. Some organisations are quite formal in the way in which they manage initiatives. So there might be documentation that you need to create. And it might be a good idea to simplify it by creating a reusable template so that everybody understands what information is required. And of course, if you have a template, it always helps to have guidance notes to explain really what information you're looking for under each of the headings in the template. We are working collaboratively with everybody on our community map, everybody who's impacted by the change. We want to involve everybody. So we might set up specific roles that we want people to perform, and it's a good idea to define exactly what their responsibilities are and what their decision-making powers are. Now, we capture that in the change management strategy that we will look at later on, but it's important to think about defining what the activities and what the responsibilities are. And you might even go further and provide questionnaires that help people think whether or not they are the right people to take on those roles, rather than just being assigned to those roles or volunteering for them without really thinking through the implications for taking on that work. I think checklists are great because you can establish all the things that should be in place or all of the tasks that should have been completed before you move on to the next step. And so that helps people make sure that nothing gets forgotten. And finally, it really helps to understand what good looks like. So let's set some acceptance criteria for the outputs. So if we're looking at our roadmap, we understand what good looks like by the end of iteration 1, and then the end of iteration 2 and 3, etc. Talking of acceptance criteria, if we're using this course as the basis for you to design your own roadmap, for you to run your own change, it's a good idea to think through what would the roadmap used in your organisation look like? What are the quality criteria or the acceptance criteria that it would actually have to meet? Now, I've suggested some here to make sure that really it's a collaborative tool. The plan, this roadmap that sets out all of the iterations and processes, should be very simple to understand. You can see in this course, it's a very simple visual, and it's an intuitive process that everyone can understand, getting started, making progress, realizing benefits. and the interdependencies between the activities are taken into account. So there's definitely a logical sort of flow as you move through doing the work, and you can see how the outputs from one step contribute to the outputs to the next step. So you can recognize what's coming up next. You can proactively prepare for the next steps and prioritize your work accordingly, especially if you're already doing a business as usual role where you're being torn in two, having to work on the change and do your normal day job. And of course, it does help to understand the points at which decisions need to be taken and the points at which you can measure progress. For example, in realizing benefits, as part of that celebrate step, we make sure that we review whether or not we're achieving any of the benefits. So a simple, intuitive process that's visually very easy to understand, perhaps, that you can easily explain to others. It's not technical, it doesn't require any predefined knowledge, so it's accessible for all, would be something that I would suggest. It's also worth bearing in mind that if you're using this roadmap approach, it's based on agile concepts, and the point is that you might want to tailor the roadmap that you create based on the culture and the type of change that you actually have. The culture of your organization definitely affects how you do things normally. So you need to reflect on how your organization works. For example, if you've got a large scope of the change, you're going to probably need to be quite formal in documenting the scope of the change, the benefits of the change, and your approach, your change management strategy. But if you've got quite a small scope, you've probably got fewer people involved in it. You can probably be a bit more informal. If there's only 4 or 5 of you working on the change and you're all working quite closely together, you might not need quite so many formal sort of documents or, in fact, decision points. Again, that formality is probably affected also by the time period. The shorter the time frame, you probably need to spend a lot less time documenting things because you haven't got much time. You need to get on and do things. And of course, if you don't have a wide-ranging scope for your change, if it's quite a narrow, specific change, you probably don't need to evaluate lots of different options for how you're going to do it. So you can probably cut down the time needed for iteration 1. The culture of your organisation will probably affect the level of central control. If you have a very hierarchical structure where there's lots of different management levels and there's very clear reporting lines and decision-making authority for each of those levels, then you're probably going to have to adhere to every single step on the roadmap and be very clear about how you have done that, evidence each step to make sure you can demonstrate its completeness. Whereas if you're in a slightly more flexible organisation, that isn't quite as centrally determined, if there's lots of opportunities for people with lower down the ranks, if you like, to take decisions, and there's a little bit more sort of informality, then you can reflect that in the way in which you use the roadmap. The decision points won't be escalated out to large committees, for example. It'll be an informal decision amongst those of you who are working on the change. So the end of your iteration and the decision to move on to the next iteration, for example, will be quite simple. And finally, don't ignore terminology. I've suggested in this course some simple terminology, such as getting started, making progress, realizing benefits. I've called each chunk of the time frame an iteration, but you don't have to be held to that. Pick language that reflects the type of organization that you work in. Some organizations are very formal and they would find my informal terminology off-putting, whereas others would welcome it. So think about the naming conventions that work in your organization, and you might want to make some changes so that it's much easier for people to understand and digest the roadmap. As I said, I'm expecting you to want to use a sort of roadmap structure because it's based on agile concepts to run any change within your organization, anything you're involved in. So it's a good idea at this point to step back and think, what does good look like? What's the absolute minimum criteria that my roadmap must meet for it to be useful, taking into account the the tailoring that we've just talked about, taking into account the core elements that we described. And of course, I've given you some example acceptance criteria in this session as well. So just have a think through and plan ahead and think, this is what my roadmap should include.